I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. On this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're talking to a heavy hitter in the area of marketing and entrepreneurship. His name is Dr. Marcus Collins, and he's a best-selling author of a book called For the Culture. And he's also a clinical marketing professor at the University of Michigan. But that's just a little bit about him. Welcome, Dr. Collins, to the BIN.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, for those of you of our listeners who just don't know you, you have a very long, winding resume, which includes a lot of, you've become a guru in the advertising world. You've you've actually founded a music and tech startup and worked with big companies like iTunes, as well as megastars like Beyoncé. But before you got to be Mr. Big Stuff, can you talk about how you got your start a little bit and just give us kind of a short version of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. As a product of Detroit, where I'm from, I went to University of Michigan, studied engineering, realized engineering wasn't the best fit for me, but also realized my parents didn't care. So I finished my engineering degree, went to the music industry, did a startup with another engineer turned music business aspirant. Did a startup, went back to school to get my MBA, then went to go work at Apple, met Matthew Knowles, who brought me in to run digital strategy for Beyoncé, and then found myself in the world of advertising, which is really where I cut my teeth. Advertising sort of created the landscape for me to take the rigor that I've acquired from being an engineer, take my creative ambitions as a songwriter in the world of music, and sort of take this idea of using network theory as a way to understand how people consume, particularly through culture. And that bricolage of different experiences sort of create the landscape by which I practice now.
Wow. Well, I know that your work has now brought you to working with the upcoming election and with a consumer platform named Suzy, and they're polling of voters for your book. For the Culture takes a really deep dive into how and why people from different groups connect in different areas and how they define themselves through culture. And knowing that many polls already say that the country is pretty much like 50-50 split down the middle in terms of ideology, some leaning to Kamala Harris, others to Donald Trump. Have you broken down the cultural definition for each of these sides? Because at first I thought it was like old versus young, make America great again versus the crowd of the new progressive look. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the answers always are somewhere in the middle. When we put labels to things like Republican, Democrat, or even independent, there's so much gray area between those spaces, those polars. And when I realized that even people who identify as a Republican, they may have similar ideologies to someone who identifies as a Democrat. And the idea there is to appeal to the shared beliefs as opposed to the moniker they use to self-identify. What I find in the research that we're doing with Suzy is that there's far more middle ground between these two polar opposites with regards to their group affiliations than we realize. For instance, we saw that when it comes to the Supreme Court, for instance, while Democrats feel one way about the Supreme Court, Republicans don't have that same sort of angst with regards to the institution. However, they both have a want for greater transparency. And both sides believe that some reform is necessary. So if we see there's some area where there's agreement, that to me says there's opportunity for us to work together to get to progress. Because to your point, in a society where 50-50 with regards to party affiliations, the only way we're going to make any inroads to find somewhere in the middle.
What have you found with statistics in the Suzy poll when it comes to Black voters? Are there any issues that are more important to them? And I'm wondering, where does the idea of like reparations lie on that list, long list of things?
Well, I mean, that's another thing, like Black voters. That's a demographic representation of people. Right? You put 10 Black people in a room and they can see the world differently, right? Because we know that Black people are a monolith. We are extremely heterogeneous. even we say Black culture, what we really refer to as a predominant Black culture. But inside of Black culture, there's also HBCU culture, there's hip hop culture, there's Black church, there's all of these things, all of these many, many cultures. So what we try to do with the study or the research that we're continuing to do is move beyond the demographics, move beyond sort of the party affiliations, and start looking at people based on the way they make meaning. So we do relate it to how they self-identify via party, but we don't look at demography so much. Instead, we look at what do these people believe, and what do they believe, and how do they see the world. And that helps us better understand how they make meaning of the world, which ultimately helps us translate that data into something meaningful.
What are you finding that are common themes among those that you've studied?
I think that ultimately people are not happy. And you go, surprise, surprise. I think that people feel a sense of tension, and rightfully so. Whether it's social tension because of the divisiveness that exists at the moment, but also the institutions that we have long trusted are proving themselves to be not trustworthy, right? There's an erosion of confidence with regards to media, erosion of confidence with regards to government, even food, for instance. Like there's just so much angst that we have that actually kind of creates more anxiety among the voting populace, or say society writ large. So we realize is that these the diminished capacity of trust that we have, this mechanism that absorbs uncertainty, this diminishing mechanism that we use to help us sort of live a life that is not full of anxiety, are creating these partitions between us and our institutions. And as a result, we find ourselves not buying into it, not engaging it, sort of separating from it, which puts us in more boxes with people like ourselves as opposed to trying to find where we actually have congruence.
Did you take a look at perhaps men versus women and voters in that regard?
Yeah, so we saw men versus women, and I think that what happens is that when you apply that label to it, you don't get anything meaningful. It's like, what do all women do that's not biologically driven? And we actually, we're in a state now where we see that, like gender is actually fluid. So, these monikers that we use don't accurately represent who we are. Like for instance, we take my demographics, 45, Black, from Detroit, went to public schools my entire life. And if you use that as a way to describe me, you would get essentially tropes. You get essentially a set of stereotypes that represent that box that people have in their minds that is assigned to those characteristics. Instead, what we're looking at is what do people believe? How do they see the world? Because the way we see the world is a far more accurate representation of how we make meaning of the world. That's why for some a cow is leather, for others the deity, for some it's dinner. Which one is it? It's all those things depending on how you see the world. So we remove the demographic representation, think more about how they make meaning.
Well, some of the predictions for, I guess, 2050, going up to 2050, is that we're going to have a multicultural majority. And
Yeah.
your book, the For the Culture, talks about cultural trends and how history of storytelling crafts and molds our culture and kind of what we see is important. And I think that, in my opinion, the backlash against the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion by a lot of white America, book bans, don't want to tell that story, don't put that there so kids can look at it. Corporate America, they're kind of the backlash against diversity, equity, inclusion. Do you think that this is going to shift again because of the change in the majority?
Well,
If so,
God,
how?
God willing, prayerfully, inshallah. The idea of diversity has been so perverted that we've almost lost sight of what it really is. You know, Diversity is really just heterogeneity with regards to perspective, right? It's just that we can look at the same thing and see many different things. And that's actually a good thing. And in my studies in the world of culture, it unearthed one very clear truth, a formidable truth, that things aren't the way they are the way that we are. That is, the world is not objective, it's subjective, right? And we see the world and translate the world through our meaning making systems based on our cultural subscription. Therefore, which I think is the powerful part here, that your worldview and your perspective is just as valid as my own. because none of it's objective. And so long as your worldview and your perspective doesn't mean my marginalization or my eradication or my erosion, then we can actually get along. In fact, we're actually better when we do because we benefit from the diversity bonus, right? I liken it this way. If we think about the social world as a basketball game, if you have courtside seats and I have nosebleed seats, we're watching two different games. We observe the same the same events take place, but how we translate them based on our perspective. Which means if we want the most accurate representation of the game, that is, we want the most accurate representation of the game of life, we need to sit in many seats. And that's what diversity gets us. So hopefully, as we have more people who represent more diverse perspectives by their very nature, we'll be able to unseat the hegemony that we kind of reside in, but open up more opportunities to sit in more seats.
In a way, it leads to, history, because history really depends on who tells it and who, well, from what vantage point that individual was watching and their own background and all that kind of feeds into it. Watching the Democratic National Convention, you could see that there's like a theme of freedom, or we're not going back, joy. That's their kind of that idea that people are kind of pulling into the whole thing, but that's their perspective of everything. And that's hopefully going to change mindsets. Some people are going to say that that's what they want, but I'm just wondering, in your opinion, does, I guess, the mindset, that enthusiasm, um, that's writing one story is going to maybe push them to the polls, but people are not quite sure if it is is that the thing that pushes people to the polls or something else?
1,000,000% yes. Most of our decisions are made through emotions. Like, think of ourselves as rational actors, but we are not. We're not rational, we're rationalizing. That is, we look at the world and we translate it through our meaning making system, that is our culture. It makes us feel a thing. And because of what we feel, we act, we behave. And then we take data points to justify the decisions we've already made based on what we feel. So we take a Kamala Harris and her campaign ethos about freedom, that freedom is about moving forward and we're not moving backwards. People who see the world that way go, I'm for that. Even if you are, quote unquote, a Republican, you may say, you know what, I believe in that. And we saw the exact same thing in 2007, 2008 with Barack Obama. He said, look, we don't have a problem with ideas or legislation. People think the government is broken. So what did he run on? Hope that together we can. And people who subscribe to Republican said, kind of buy that. I'm kind of into that. That speaks more to who I am, to what I believe. And whether you like it or not, it's exactly what we saw in 2016. That, Trump's take was, hey, we've gone too far. We need to go back to a time that probably was not was not equitable for many of us, at least 40 million of us in this country. Right?
Mm,
Going back, his idea was make America great again. And
mm.
people went to the polls. If you polled or asked a subset of the country in those moments of time and asked them, what was the policy that Barack Obama had in 2008? People look at you with blank stares. And in 2016, they probably say, build the wall, because it was a meme, basically. And then even with Kamala Harris, they may say, women should have bodily autonomy. But what's the policy? The policy is the rational arguments. They're the rational things. But what gets us to move is the emotional things. The same thing that happens at the ballot box is the same thing that happens in our shopping centers. This happens in the grocery stores. How we consume, how we behave is all based on what we feel. And those who are able to activate the emotional part of the brain that we call the limbic system are the people who are most inclined to get people to move.
Hmm. So what would you say is emotionally motivating those who are supporting Trump?
Oh, well, I think two things. One, people believe him. They see the world the way he does. They believe in a xenophobic makeup of the country. They believe that they have been wrong. They believe that their spot in line has been taken from them from someone else. And this is the dog whistle that Trump has given them since 2016. And they say that's our guy because he is the personification of the beliefs and ideologies that they have of the world. And whether Trump believes that or not is another story. I mean, Trump is just a, he's sort of a, he's a figurehead. He's an artifact that signifies this belief system. But if you remove Trump, put someone else in who has the same beliefs, they're like, that's our guy. It's
Yeah.
the ideologies that people are subscribing to. Trump was just the first person to sort of say it out loud with the level of conviction that he had.
Well, I know we're running out of time, and I want to make sure I get to you telling me finally what I guess what surprised you in getting going through a lot of these statistics and such. I know there's got to be some things that just kind of like threw you like, what?
Well, I was actually so there are some things that that were not surprising at all. There are some things that are like, on the Democratic side, there was a want for more diversity. And the Republican side was like, nah, we don't need any of that. Right. That wasn't surprising at all. But it was these things that sat in the middle that really kind of made me feel very optimistic. That like, listen, we actually all kind of want the same things. It's just our perspective or our opinion of how those things are achieved are different. But if we can just start right at the middle ground, right where we actually agree on a thing, we can actually start building something that might be a better version than our own individually, but together, right? I think about conversations I have with my wife. It's like when we are at odds, what do? We find common ground. And the common ground here is that we are all Americans. We live in this country. We share this real estate and we cohabitate and we actually need each other. We need each other for us to get the most out of the life that we have all sort of inspired for and what this country had supposedly had promised us. And the idea there is that we get there by first find the humanity in each one of us and use that as the starting point. Then from there, build to what will hopefully be a better tomorrow than it is today. And maybe that's a little naive, and maybe a little utopic, but I do, in my heart of hearts, believe that it's possible.
Well, you are inspiring, Dr. Marcus Collins. I appreciate you joining us on the BIN.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. The book is called For the Culture, and it's out in everywhere that you can pick it up on Amazon and anywhere you look out on the internet. I'm Esther Dillard for the Black Information Network.